Let's try something different. Welcome to the studio of OlyTV. I'm your host, Alan, and, well, you're actually watching OlyTV, if you'd be surprised about that. Now, here at the broadcasting studio, we edit a lot. For example, I could edit my face out right now and blur it for you. Or I could edit myself saying these very same words multiple times in a row. Either way, editing today is relatively simple. I mean, on TikTok you see all these transitions. And, well, on social media you can see almost everything from YouTube tutorials.
In this video, I'm going to show you how to edit a YouTube video from beginning to end fast in Premiere Pro.
To Twitter rants and compilations. Though, it wasn't always this simple. Let's dive into the history of film editing. To start off, how did film start? Back in 1890, while they may not be the first to film a video, the Lumiere brothers are definitely one of the most famous. They were one of the first ones to take video and distribute it. Though these videos really did lack some editing. Most of these clips were taken from the public streets and were usually taken in one take. It wasn't until 1897 when Come Along Do, a film, came out with the first few clips of actual editing with a transition or two. This was relatively simple, but it was revolutionary at the time. One could simply just take a couple scenes and put them together, and that's exactly what people did. The method they used was splice editing, and the actuality is relatively simple. I mean, you took two pieces of negative film, cut it, and then taped them together. But there was some expertise in it, especially when trying to figure out where to cut or where to tape. And this came with a few shortcomings. Negative film was a bit hard to handle. With a bit of light or sunlight, you could ruin an entire film. Along with this, negative film usually had to be in one cut, so if you were recording for a long time, a huge reel would be inconvenient to work with. For the next 40 or so years, from 1900 to 1940, cutting and taping two pieces of film together was relatively the standard. Though there were some inventions to make the process easier. For example, in 1920, the moviola was invented. This new machine could allow the editor to be able to splice more accurately by feeding negative film to gears. They no longer had to have it in their hands. They could also view the film more accurately under a light that would not harm the film. And like I said earlier, this was relatively the standard. The only exception to this was the invention of film cement, which was widely used during the 1940s. This type of solvent liquid with a little bit of film negative dissolved in it could be used as glue. We've been focusing on film but not enough sound, and what happened with that? Well, if we go back to the 1890, the very first type of sound recording was called the kinetoscope, which Thomas Edison was able to be successful with. This process used a block of wax to imprint the sound and then output it through this tuba-looking thing. And let me tell you, this did not sound good at all. So for the first 20 or so years of film, from the 1900s to 1920, most theaters relied on live bands and performances, either stashed away behind a curtain or behind the screen. Audiences would have to listen to the music and read the captions on screen to be able to feel the tone and the energy from the film. Though this was relatively expensive, hiring bands every time. So in the 1920s, this pushed for a new innovation in sound. Sound on film was one of these innovations and methods to record sound. Basically, sound would be recorded and then transmitted into electrical pulses. and at the end of this wire of electrical pulses would be a light bulb. Remember that negative film that could be ruined by sunlight? Well, that shortcoming had a use. Depending on the strength of the electricity, the light would be brighter or darker depending on how powerful the sound was. This light would then expose the negative film to be able to record sound on the film, and then it would be outputted. Though, there was one flaw with this, and it was pretty quiet. Eventually though, amplifiers were created to be able to amplify the sound, and now sound could be recorded faithfully. During the same decade, in the 20s, the Warner Brothers company invested into sound engineering. With this investment, they established the Vitaphone, a machine that could record sound on a separate reel, which was called sound on disc. The Vitaphone actually recorded sound in a similar fashion to the kinetoscope made by Thomas Edison. But there was one key difference. The sound quality did not suck.
The studio in actual operation. And that is the next thing we're going to do.
All the time in the tropical time where they do that funny, funny dance. I fell in love with the tropical dove while doing that funny, funny dance. For the poor little kid, she never did have a bed.
And so the industry jumped on this opportunity to be able to faithfully record sound easily. And this is exemplified through the movies called the talkies. These movies were called the talkies for a reason, because now you could hear the actors sing or talk. The most famous of all which was the jazz singer.
Goodbye. Don't cry. The little choo-choo train. Oh, I'm going to steal something. I'll give it back to you someday, too. You see if I don't. Mama, darling, if I'm a success in this show, well, we're going to move from here. Oh.
Audiences were excited that they could hear actors sing and talk at the same time. Now there's a push for more sound in film, and the way theaters would implement this sound was to synchronize the soundtrack and the film at the same time. Alongside with the Vitaphone, Fox, the entertainment company, had actually invested into Tri-Ergon, and this allowed the industry to be able to record sound faithfully everywhere. For a recap, from the 1920s to the 1940s, sound on disc was relatively the standard, as well as recording on film. Films would synchronize separate discs of sound with the film that they recorded, cutting and splicing it and editing it together to make a movie. But this all changed in the 1950s, where sound and film sort of merged together. And, well, magnetic film was the reason. Magnetic strips, laced with iron oxide on the outside and magnetic flux on the inside, could now be used to record basically sound and film. Using magnetic pulses, they could imprint the picture of sound, though sound was still separate from the movie and would be played on speakers all around. With new innovations in speakers, such as from Dolby, movies became more immersive. Now, after the 1950s filled with these magnetic strips and tape recorders, computers really innovated the industry. In the 1960s, experiments with digital sound recording eventually led to the 70s, where sound could now be recorded digitally. Basically, these sound waves can now be recorded into analog or digital waves and then transmitted back to you. Now, this sounds really complicated, but all you need to know is that now we could upload things to our computers and listen to them back. In a similar fashion, the same thing could be done with film, with digital recordings now available to be uploaded onto the computers. Thus, with computers, it really ended the fashion of splice editing. Coming into the 80s, new softwares that allowed non-linear editing became popular. During this time, you would see apps like Adobe or Avid Media Composer being used to edit these videos, and now you could basically drag and drop to edit the video. By the early 2000s, NLEs, or non-linear editing software, became available to everyone with DaVinci Resolve and Final Cut Pro. Alongside with this, your home computer became more powerful. Nowadays, editing software is available everywhere. and allows us to edit at home, dragging and dropping, doing all these effects like I did at the beginning of the video.